Last time we covered the development of the Dutch 1895 long rifle. Today we'll see just how many ways they could shorten it up, as seemingly every branch of the army wanted their own version. Hi, I'm Othais, and this, as apparent to you, is probably the Dutch Carbine No. 3 old model carbine. Now that statement is entirely false, but I'll unpack it later towards the end of the episode. Instead, for now, let's all pretend and look in the light box. Coming in just under 37½ inch in length and weighing 7.4 pounds, this is a dandy darling. It has a magazine capacity of 5 6.5 by 53 millimeter rimmed cartridges, and of course those are fed from an end block clip. What a delight. Alright gang, don't forget that our growth is actually more a function of what you do rather than what we do. So like, subscribe, and comment. Maybe engage with us on social media, share us with your friends. And if you'd like to support the show directly, that means Patreon or Subscribestar, or you can head on over to C&Rsenal.com and check out the shop. Let's get to the history. In our last episode, I gave you guys the complete rundown on the development and adoption of the Dutch 1895 long rifle. Just to make this clear and concise, this was the Mauser Schlegelmilchmannlicher OEWG modified Gewehr 88 with Romanian ammo and Italian-like quadrant sights and a British bayonet mount. So, you know, simple. Well, as we often see, 4.5 foot long rifles don't necessarily prove to be perfect for everyone in an army. Honestly, they're pretty much only good for the infantry, and even that's debatable. Like most militaries around the world in the 1890s, the Dutch put an emphasis on their cavalry, and at the time of the 1895's adoption, they had passed on the previous Beaumont rifle in favor of a rolling block carbine. Now obviously if the infantry were going over to a smokeless repeater, the cavalry would like to join, and so as early as 1892 that Dutch Rifle Commission was looking at a carbine version of the various guns they were reviewing, which really by 1893 was just the OEWG rifle as shown by August Schriever. 40 shortened versions of that gun would be ordered in February and were issued to the Hussars for field trials. While some minor improvements were suggested, overall the inspector of the cavalry found them fit for service. This appears to have realistically just resulted in the OEWG action getting the thumbs up overall, and the carbine issue would hold for about 1 year after official adoption of the rifle. So while this guy was adopted in December of 1895, the final carbine pattern, contract negotiation, and final adoption followed in December of 1896. This resulted in the following: a 37-inch long half-stocked side-slung carbine. Uniquely, this gun sports a wooden cover set over the left side of the magazine. This was done to prevent undue wear on the uniform when worn across the back. It was not meant to take a bayonet, but we'll see some changes to that a bit further in the episode. There would be a modification to the number 1 in 1900, a simple matter. They were retroactively modified to allow the safety to be turned when the gun was decocked. This allowed them to be carried firing pin down, chamber empty, and not allow the bolt to be bounced open when on horseback or whacked up against something as it rode on your back. Originally, the new carbine was the only carbine, so for a brief period it was just called Carbine 1895. However, it would soon be renamed the number 1 carbine, as we're about to see a quick adoption of another. Just to save on future confusion, I'll go ahead and tell you now, it will eventually be replaced with a new cavalry carbine later on, which would then take the moniker of the number 1 carbine. So the retroactive proper name for this is the number 1 old model carbine. I think you all might now have a tiny inkling as to how deep this well will go. The highest known number was from a 1937 inventory revealing over 7,000. Total maximum production likely exceeded this into the 8,000 range at some point. With the cavalry covered, it was time for the Marechaussee. This was the Netherlands' own gendarmerie, although after their dealings with the French, they weren't so big on that exact word anymore, so they renamed them and reformed the organization. Just like with other countries in the 1890s, these guys had become something of a military police force, the constabulary-ish. Officially, they worked for the Minister of Defense, but really served the Department of Justice. Before I go any further, I want to make sure that I say the Continental Maréchaussée were not the same as their colonial namesake. We're going to talk about them later. The Dutch East Indies units will get their own episode, as their equipment demands and experiences were wholly unique. Our Continental Military Police were also prior users of the rolling block. And once the cavalry started testing a new carbine, they got in on the action as well. In July of 1895, the War Department had 2 of the then experimental cavalry carbines modified to take a folding bayonet, much like the prior rolling blocks had. The result would eventually be this, the number 2 old model, underslung for the Maréchaussée, who mostly worked on foot and sporting a unique folding bayonet. Production is estimated at fewer than 1,800 total, though only 528 were in inventory by 1940, making them exceptionally rare to see today. Next in line behind the Maréchaussée were the Genie, the engineers of the army, and right behind them were some other uniquely Dutch concerns, ponteniers and torpedoes, the men who had to arrange all that bridge building for all the water crossing, and those that manned the shore-fired torpedoes. Just like with the Maréchaussée, 2 more rifles were pulled from the original cavalry trials guns and modified to accept a standard long rifle bayonet plus a full-length handguard. After some fiddling and trials, this was the result. Underslung for foot troops and with a crazy long upper handguard, we now have, well, actually, this is our gun today, isn't it? It isn't, but only on a technicality that I'll reveal later. For now, however, we can pretend that this is our gun today and take a closer look. Alright, we got a much shorter gun than that rifle from last time. Look at this guy, all the way to the front, where we still have a very familiar front sight, dovetailed, and then almost identical bayonet lug, although this time with a forward swivel. Now, they would actually decide the stock infantry bayonet was too short, and ultimately went with a larger 23½ inch blade, but it was otherwise pretty similar, except in another uniform-saving nod, the release button for these bayonets was turned 90 degrees, now facing downwards to prevent rubbing. Now, the most obvious feature of this carbine is its extremely unique handguard, which extends past the forward band, is unsupported underneath. I don't know of any other military rifle that has this, and to my knowledge, this was done to prevent any chance of heat mirage interacting with your front sight and interrupting your ability to aim, especially when you have a short sight radius. I'm unsure if that's 100% true, but I've seen no other real explanation for it. Now, this is honestly a rare part to see. Most imported guns in the collector circles lack these as the importer. They were either damaged and they didn't want to replace them, or what were there in order to have consistency, they were taken off and thrown away. The reason so many were damaged is because this is how simple it is to remove it. I'll lift up this sight a little bit, and I'm just going to put maybe like a pound and a half of pressure at the front here. That's clip 1 up, and I'm going to keep going, and that's clip 2 up, and we are loose. And not only are we're not off the gun. Like if this just popped off the gun, that's bad enough. The other problem though is we're now sort of loosely attached to this sight in a way that allows us to get torqued and easily snapped at the rear right here. I'm being fairly delicate. To get it off properly, you would pull this all the way up, and then we'd have enough room, presumably, let me get where you guys can see, we'd have enough room to turn this almost 90 degrees and pop her off that sight. But you can see anywhere in that process, we're pretty vulnerable to damage, and so these guns likely took a lot of it and had to have these replaced, not infrequently. So, let me put that down. These are not necessarily common sight in the collector's market today. Now, if I look at the sight base area, we'll see that there is a flat milled into the wood. I'm assured that this came about in the 1930s. They used to have a more domed shape, but it was getting in the way of the sight line, so flat it is. If I walk her on back, oh, by the way, nice, deep, long finger rest. As I come back though, we have the standard Schlegelmilch Mannlicher action. Nothing is different between this and the infantry rifle. Same ejector, same extractor, same everything, same clips, same ammo. Beautifully compatible and probably very easy on manufacturing in that regard. And right here I need to make a correction from the last episode. I had said that the Romanian Dutch Mannlichers were similar in action, and that was true, especially of the earlier Romanian 1892. But I also said the parts could not interchange. However, our favorite collector John did a little experiment, and it turns out bolt components between the two do swap easily. This would not be true, however, of a Romanian 1893 rifle, as that had a different ejector system, which you can, of course, see in better detail in our Romanian Mannlicher episode, which further covers the differences between these guns and the previous Gewehr 1888. Alright, back to it. If I bring it back, we're going to see that this is an underslung action. Don't pay too much attention to any other little features though, because I am still telling you a great and terrible lie. Alright, we have the gun, and the mechanism is just the same as last time. That means we can go straight to a demonstration. You know, this thing's pretty dang handy, and I'm sure Mae will have strong opinions in just a little bit, but for now, let's keep going with the history. The simplest reason I can give for my having the number 3 in hand and not the previous 2 models is because this pattern by far was the most common of the Dutch carbine configurations, and for good reason. In 1899, issue was expanded to the Fortress artillery, and from there, military reforms and expansion led to more and more specialty troops. The number 3 became the default selection, and so despite ordering just over 3,500 by 1897, the highest known count for these guys exceeds 60,000, with the exact number unknown. A 1937 inventory reveals some 51,000 still on hand, however, which is about the time that some regular army units were also starting to receive these as standard rifles. The Netherlands were considering a universal carbine, but before we get there, we're gonna have to rewind because there is one more gun in the original numbered series. You see, the good old number 3 just wasn't good enough for the Bicyclists. In 1897, the Dutch army decided that part of each infantry class had to be trained as military cyclists. This was a further attempt to speed up their mobilization. It also gave a further nod to other powers that the Netherlands meant to protect its furthest borders. The use of bicycles gained a lot of traction and peaked in 1910 with 4 companies. These men, however, would need their own carbine as the cavalry model did not take a bayonet. So they hybrided the number 1 and the number 3, producing 8 trials guns in 1908 and adopting the new pattern in 1909. Left side sling points, although now fixed wire and non-swiveling, a magazine cover, they kept the number 3 long bladed bayonet, that oversized handguard as well, which you will probably never see because it would be changed out on nearly every single one of these guys around 1922. I actually have one of those post-1920 modded guns right here. I guess it doesn't look all that different from that side. Maybe we should look over here. Actually, you know what? Let's just quickly take a closer look and see how this differs from our number 3. Oh, another carbine. This time we have a handguard that only comes up so far. This again being a early 1920s pattern. We do still have our clearing rod for the first time on any of these guns, so you can see how it would have looked on the other two. And then if we walk our way down, we're gonna see, frankly, the back end of the handguard looks the same, the rear sight looks the same, it's zeroed the same. All the way at the rear, we still have the Schlegel Milk Mannlicher action. And I wanna point out, by the way, I don't think I said this on the first carbine, all the Continental carbines that we're concerned with have straight bolt handles just like the rifles. They did not do a turn down for the Continental Mannlicher 1895 carbines. We will see that this changes in our next episode though. So if I come on down, we're gonna see straight wrist like before, metal butt plate, no sling swivels because those are on the other side and perhaps the more interesting side. So let me make some room because we have a fixed sling swivel at the front. We have a fixed sling swivel at the rear. These are hard, they don't move. And you guys probably don't care a lick about them because look at this thing, what is going on here? Why is it the Dutch have the most interesting projects with wood? First we got the weird handguard that overextends, and then we've got this, which is a magazine cover that prevented that hard metal sharp-edged magazine, not even that sharp, but sharp enough edge to sit there and really work over a wool uniform. This nice soft wood, well, that just gets slowly polished by the wool and it doesn't tear up your uniform nearly as much. And to be honest with you, if I had to pay for maintain my own uniform, and I didn't want to get dressed down for how I was dressed up, I would probably be very happy to have this anyway. And to be honest with you, it probably doesn't add that much weight. Although, again, kind of like our extended handguard, these can be hard to find in the US in the collector's market because, again, very easily damaged, very easily knocked off the gun. If you're curious if your gun was supposed to have had one of these, I will say, if you ever see one that's missing, there's 2 square little buckle notches on the side of the magazine. If you have a plain-sided magazine and no notches, probably never had one. If you have those little, I shouldn't say notches, they're more like tabs, you'll see 2 little square tabs. The other thing is obviously there would be sort of a hard ledge right here where it used to be. Very common, again, for these to be missing. Over time, these handy side-slung guns would go on to serve with motorcyclists and armored car drivers. The high mark for the number 4 is a 1937 inventory showing 17,434 units. Given the usual attrition, I'm betting over 20,000 were made at some point. You know what? There's not a lot of difference between this one and the first one, but I don't care. Let's go ahead and let Mae shoot it and see if she picks up on anything cool. Yeah, if I close my eyes and don't reach too far out, I can't tell the difference between this guy and the previous carbine. And I'm glad you have all stuck with me for that bit of mime, because at this point we have covered all of the major variations of the Dutch 1895 carbines on the continent, that is until war were declared. Sorry guys, the Netherlands actually never entered the war. However, like I covered last time, they did mobilize, eventually up to 450,000 troops, a massive martial undertaking that resulted in the sudden return to high levels of rifle production, and that included carbines. Most of the guns I've mentioned so far included some amount of wartime production in their total numbers, and one saw wartime modification, which kind of started a domino effect. With the Western Front stabilizing into trench warfare, the role of cavalry suddenly became, well, lackluster at best. Cavalry troops were largely being fielded as infantry, where their sabers were no longer an aid. As we saw in some of our other episodes, like that French cuirassier Berthier, nations would begin affixing bayonets to their cavalry carbines. The Dutch were no exception. Despite not being in the trenches, they were not going to be caught unprepared, and so developed a socket bayonet for their number 1 cavalry carbine. These were made from converted stocks of Beaumont leftovers. While a reasonable stopgap, it ultimately proved to be unsatisfactory, mostly for a lack of any means to hold on to the absent forestock. By this point, by the way, the Dutch mounted artillery was only using a revolver for defense. Having seen the German use of a carbine, they finally decided it was a good idea to do the same. They would have to rework the number 1 carbine. It needed a full stock, a bayonet lug, a handguard, starting to sound a little bit familiar, and the result would be the new number 1, which we'll call the number 1 new model to keep things straight. This was a side-slung, long hand-guarded bayonet-mounted carbine with the same protective left side wood piece on the magazine. Honestly, other than the fact that it retains the ability to put the bolt on safe even when decocked, it's kind of a number 4 with sling swivels that rotate. The bayonet at least was a unique affair. Borrowed from the East Indies pattern, it was a shorter, 2-edged dagger-like blade. It also sported the downturned release button. The highest known number for these guys comes from a 1937 inventory at 17,700. Again, it's likely more were produced at one point, and these were just what was left over. Even if you do find one, once again, is it extremely unlikely to appear as shown. This was another model like the number 4, which received a shortened handguard starting in 1922. With the number 1 new model in place, the number 1 old models were reissued to the artillery train. And now I have to introduce you to the other Dutch rural police force, the Rijksveldwacht. As best I am able to understand it, this is a hybrid of the police and game warden, though I'm sure there is some nuance lost in translation. These guys were further users of the rolling block carbine, which had been a minor feature of their jobs until they had to deal with the growing unrest due to the Great War, and even its fallout. They wanted more carbines, and so the number 2 Marechaussee was modified in 1918, or, well, as I suspect, it was really just re-entered production with some savings put in place. Basically, it's the same carbine with folding bayonet, but now sporting a handguard, perhaps the first to have the shortened handguard as a matter of fact. The new model was also fitted with a regular front band, now with a bayonet lug, which is weirdly redundant. Honestly, it looks like this pattern was developed simply to take advantage of present parts manufacture and recycle them into a new pattern. While known serials stretch into the 8,000 range, a 1937 inventory reports only 1,136 units, so production total is a bit of a gray area. Now I bet you guys can't guess which gun is going to have the update treatment next. Blammo! Number 3 new model. Still underslung and still featuring the long handguard, the number 3 now has a wood magazine cover, which honestly doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would the underslung gun designed for shoulder carry also need the wood cover? We know it showed up in 1918 with the other new patterns, but the exact reason is a bit of a mystery. Total production of the number 3 new model is estimated around 24,000 units, but we'll see that number cannibalized in just a moment. The number 3 did get to keep its long handguard, by the way. Now, as befuddling as that gun is, at least we can see it and know that it exists physically. You can identify it. There actually was a number 4 new model, but spotting one is nigh impossible. This is the number 4 old model, just to remind you. If you change out those fixed sling loops for swivels, you get, well, okay, you get the number 1 new model. They even have the ability to use the same safety with the bolt closed. There's no difference between this and a number 1 new model. As near as I can tell, the only way to identify one is by which bayonet it was issued with, as these were issued with the old number 3 pattern. So the only way to prove that the gun is a number 4 new model would be to have the bayonet with it and have it serial matched. Period documents suggest the number 4 new model was an attempt at a carbine specifically for stormtroops, which the Netherlands began experimenting with late in the war, but abandoned as a concept in 1924. Since production of the number 4 new model started around 1923, after the adoption of the shortened handguard, it's likely the number 4 new model was almost dead on arrival. A 1937 inventory reveals 360 in stock, and honestly, I'm not even sure how they even counted them unless, again, they were counting the serial matched bayonets. There's no known way to spot one of these from a number 1 new model. Alright, that wraps up all the Martial carbines which were manufactured from scratch for the Dutch Army, so we should be getting towards the end of the episode. However, I'm still lying to you, dear viewer, about this quote-unquote number 3 carbine here. In order to come clean, I'm going to have to go post-war. This is a rare treat for our show, but pretty necessary to understand these carbines as they stand in the collector's market. In the early 1930s, with the introduction of more machine guns and mortar units, the Dutch came up short on number 4 carbines. When the request was sent in to produce more, they were summarily refused. Surveying the available wartime surplus, the Army realized that they had all the carbines they needed, plus another 9,000 in reserve. The problem is, they weren't always in the ideal location or the ideal configuration. A complicated game of musical chairs began, and for the most part, everyone ended up being satisfied, except for a gap left in what were the Dutch equivalent of the Signal Corps, their liaison troops. So an additional modification would need to be made, this time to the number 3 new model carbine. Recall I said some were cannibalized. Well, let me show you the dramatic conversion. They moved the forward sling swivel from the underside to the side and got rid of the loop. Boom, number 3 modified. Eventually 4,600 would be produced thanks to the expanding number of liaison troops. While that program was an aid, there would still be a growing demand for carbines in the more modern Dutch army, the more mobile Dutch army. So in 1939, rather last minute as we now know, another 10,000 of the number 3 new models were ordered to be converted to the number 4 pattern. So recall, we estimated the production of the new number 3 at 24,000 units. 4,600 have been taken for the number 3 modified, and now 10,000 would be changed over to number 4. The war would interrupt this process with maybe 4,000 or so completed, meaning fewer than 16,000 new number 3s would remain. And speaking of the war, it was becoming more and more apparent that Europe was heating back up and the Netherlands may need to defend itself. In November of 1937, the Director for Army Material noted that the intended expansion of the armed forces would result in a shortage of carbines. Thankfully, they had hundreds of thousands of 1895 long rifles still available for service at the affordable price of we already made them. Since they were just carbines with extra metal and wood, they just needed some reshaping. The first small steps in this process came from converting surplus guns into simplified police carbines. There are a couple versions, and I'm not going to run those down today. You'll have to check out some books to get that deep. We are in over our heads as it is. 2 army conversions were trialed briefly. I'm unsure of the differences, but one was found satisfactory. In September of 1938, this was introduced as the number 5. It was essentially a clone of the number 3 old model, full handguard, underslung, and no wood magazine guard. And with that, well, I can show you how I have lied to you since the very beginning of this episode. Let's take a look. Now, those of you who are fans of detective fiction, never let it be said that I didn't give you a chance to see what was wrong with this gun right at the start. If you had been super eagle-eyed, and if we filmed at a higher resolution, you would see, number 1, that this cartouche is marked 1940, so we are on the wire for being able to get this out of the factory. And what they did is, first of all, if we looked at the top of the gun, let me see if I can get that over to the other camera. I don't know if you can make it out, but we have the landwear markings, and we have a serial number that if you were to read the books that we link in the description, well, we mentioned in the description below, you would find out that that serial range is actually for a long rifle, and that this was very much a long rifle in its former life. But what they've done is, they fitted it with an appropriate number 3 style rear sight. And obviously that handguard that we were commenting on earlier, which makes a lot more sense why this one doesn't quite match in tone, even if it were to match in serial number. When I removed it earlier, if you had been really eagle-eyed, you'd have seen the number one telltale for this problem, which is, let me get this off, right in here, in this little tiny area right behind the barrel band. And if I remove the barrel band, you'll be able to see it more clearly. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, movie magic. I have this guy off, and we're gonna see a couple of things now that we're under here. Number one, of course, the step that I already started to mention. Boom, the barrel has been turned down from a big, heavier rifle barrel in order to fit on this, a standard carbine style front band, which is actually unusual for number 5. Now, I've seen a couple of these examples, but this is very much some sort of number 3 band that was available either in the used parts bin or in the unissued parts bin. I don't believe this is a match to this rifle because what you would normally see is that this sling swivel would actually be on a tab that was welded onto the bottom of a rifle band. So they would take the rifle band, scoot it all the way back down, and then boom, weld that guy on, and you'd have your band. In this case, it's an original carbine band, which is why I was able to lie to you as easily as I was, because it's the most outstanding feature is seeing that tab right there would help you recognize a number 5 in a heartbeat without taking it all apart. Now, underneath, the stock was not recut for a clearing rod. So there would be no clearing rod on a proper number 5, which means this one was never missing its clearing rod. It never had it. Again, I'm sorry for being such a deceptive person. The last tell on this whole thing is the fact that they move the rear sling, which I did not show you a clear angle on before, but I can now. So we've got our swivel all the way down here, which it would have been on a normal carbine, which had moved from up here where it was on the long rifle a little bit further forward. And you can see where they filled it in. So overall, that's how you would tell a number, that's how you would tell a number 3 from a number 5 carbine. Initially, 9,500 number 5s would be ordered. These had time enough to be completed, but a massive mobilization in 1939 created a 50,000 unit further order. As we know, there would not be enough time to complete this. Germany would invade in 1940. It's estimated as many as 35,500 number 5 carbines may have been completed, making them one of the more common versions found in today's collector market. Much more rare is the Dutch naval carbine. Again, a conversion of the long rifle. This was the result of planning from 1935, which hoped to convert all naval rifles into carbines, but ultimately ran into the same war-shortened schedule, resulting in fewer than 2,000 being completed before the invasion. With all that, I kind of have to talk about this other war, this Second Great War, because that's where a lot of these things served. I mean, the Dutch guns didn't fight in World War I, they fought in World War II very briefly, because Dutch forces were overwhelmed and surrender came in just 4 days. The problem is not with the rifle, though. I mean, it's not exactly high technology for World War II, but the real problems they had were higher level problems. They had suspended training maneuvers to save money. They were short on armor, artillery, machine guns, and especially short on aviation. Their communications were still tethered, even though they were exporting radios. And the rifle, well, okay, yeah, it's 1918 vintage at best, but really not a big factor. As much as I would like to say, oh, they could have had a better gun for World War II, they honestly could have invested in a lot of things for World War II ahead of the rifle. So let's kind of walk this back and stay within that pre-1918 era when we talk to Mae about what it's like to handle this particular gun. All right, gang, once more we've made room for Mae, and this time we have 2 carbines to talk about. One is my lie to all of you, I apologize. This is actually a number 5.
This is such a pretty little lie.
Yep, and then right here is the number 4.
Like it's a dual wield today, yes!
Realistically, there's very little differences between these 2 guns, except for in terms of stocking, which is actually
pretty much
the only real difference between any of the Dutch carbines. So I'm hiding behind this gun. The only real difference between any of these Dutch carbines is the stocking, because they all tend to have the same barrel length. They all tend to have to have the same action, same sights, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, stocking is sling swivels.
Right, but I would consider that all. And the interesting thing is a lot of that stuff that we don't get to test for, because we don't do bayonet testing. So the difference between that as a handguard and this as a handguard, or not having one at all, doesn't usually
Finger
register.
grooves, potentially?
this stuff doesn't shine. So when we talk about these two guns, we're really talking about the same gun. What's it like to shoot an 1895 that's really short?
Yeah, that's really tiny.
Yeah. So again, that comes up to you. So we are a little bit out of order, but that is the earlier handguard style.
Yep.
So let's start with this one. Give me a quick tour of your feelings about the ergonomics on this gun.
So realistically, action, all of this going to be the same as what we talked about with the long rifle. So no real difference there, guys. Like he said, we're getting into just length and the stocking on these really being the big difference. And then obviously we switched to the carbine sights.
Right.
But yeah, it feels so much better when it's this light.
Yeah, where's
it's
that
so
balance
mobile.
point at?
Fortunately, it's behind
nice
the mag.
into the rear.
Yeah, nice into the rear. So I'm getting a nice, good shoulder set with that one.
Oh, it might be right on the mag.
Really?
Oh, that's nice. That
This needs to be like a TV game where it's like, dun, 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 balance the rifle.
Yeah. But that puts, by the way, we like
right
it to the rear a little bit because it puts that weight between the two arms. And then also if small cartridge, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But having the balance point right at that magazine means that you now have no difference in balance at all.
Loaded or unloaded.
Right.
Perfect.
So what about that funky handguard?
Yeah, I was looking at that. Realistically, it's nice, obviously, that you got the handguard here for when you go up to grab the rifle. If it's stacked up against something, you can easily grab it here, not a problem. But it's kind of nice that I can choose to grab it wherever I want, which is kind of cool.
Right.
But honestly, I'm a little bit concerned that I'm gonna ding this. Like, I'm very worried about this piece of wood when I had it on range, when it's here in the gun room. Like, I'm just gonna whack it and it's gonna get popped.
Now see, I weirdly like that handgun.
Okay.
I think it's too easily damaged the way it's configured, but the extension beyond, it makes sense to me in one regard, and I don't think I touched on this yet. When I went looking through the notes, I could not find a mention of exactly why they went for the overextended handguard, which means sticking out over all of this.
Yeah, that does seem really bizarre to me.
I imagine it would do two things. Number one, you're really not going to see heat mirage because there's only like this much barrel to really cook and do anything.
Okay, fair.
But the other thing, only when you think in terms of a bayonet, if you mount your bayonet here, you can grab the bayonet itself
and really huck with the bayonet. Oh my god.
Right. So instead of being back here, not holding the bayonet itself, you have enough room here to get your hand on that pommel of the bayonet and then hold the gun at the rear and look at how much room you have to work.
That kind of makes me feel like you'd be able to use the bayonet not only just more with more finesse, but like more as a tool as anything else.
Now, these are a lot like the old British style of bayonet in which, and I'm sorry I don't have one to show you, but they lock in closer up to that barrel too. So that means the bayonet's going to prevent you from touching the hot barrel. This wood is going to protect you from touching the hot barrel, and you can get in front of the sling swivel on this particular style, and then boom, you've got your grip.
I'm kind of with you now. I think that's actually pretty cool. If that's a good use, if that's a good reasoning for why they did that.
Yeah, my suspicion is the very far forward sling point. This sling point that leaves you no room to grab back here unless you're in your sling.
It kind of makes sense. Yeah.
It's my suspicion that that's why this extended handguard stayed on this model when it was abandoned on so many others.
Oh, I could see that.
I don't know for sure. This is speculation, ladies and gentlemen.
That is cool speculation, though. Yeah. I would have never thought of that.
I'm always nervous, by the way, to give those ideas out because people run away with them and say it's a fact. And it's total speculation on my part until I can find a primary source that tells me otherwise. So I think as a bayonet fighter, I actually prefer that over something like this. But if you look at this gun that has the short handguard, you have all this room to handle it back here behind the sling.
Right, so they've moved the sling back so you've literally, any hand size can practically fit there.
Right, you're fine to not have to get so far forward on this.
Even Othais size hands fit.
Yeah, thank you. So, I'm sorry, we got way off track.
We did, but that was just really cool.
How does this feel, before we get to shooting and everything,
okay,
how does this feel in terms of handling? Like, is this feeling a lot more rapid than the long rifle, or is there no real gain on getting it this short?
Realistically, it all just boils down to mobility, ladies and gentlemen, because that's what this offers. Like, there's no difference in, like, action-wise. Like, everything else felt just as rapid. It's just a matter of, if I'm going to be running or moving with it, I'd rather take one of these little carbines over the long rifle.
Yep, and then the big difference, the only real reason to, not make it as short as possible is ballistic performance and also the perceived recoil. So
that's true, there is significantly more recoil.
Talk to me about shooting these guys. What's it like?
So, yes. Definitely some more recoil to that, but let's start at the top. Obviously, sight difference, it's kind of interesting. These sights are shorter, which is actually pretty nice for me because they're not eating up as much as my sight. So they're just an improved quadrant sight. That's realistically what they are.
You're shorter than the long rifle.
Right.
Okay.
And then trigger, no real difference there. And then that's when we get into the recoil.
Right.
The recoil, yeah, there is substantially more recoil on this one. The carbines in general, I'm going to say. I couldn't perceive any difference between the two if I'm trying to think about it. It just doesn't feel like there was much of a difference because pretty much same length, pretty much same weight. Yeah, you can't really perceive it if you're trying, I would say. But yeah, I don't think it's unmanageable. It's just high up there. When I switched immediately that day from the long rifle to the carbine, I was like, oh, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, you start to notice it quicker. Yeah. I would say overall the recoil is quite manageable.
Oh yeah, it's not terrible. I mean, I've certainly shot worse. I
think the king of bad recoil, like the king of oh god recoil. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Probably something like the Berthier in 8mm Lebel.
Yeah, the Berthier honestly is up there.
In a 3-shot 1892 pattern, because that's the gun that's lighter than this one shooting a full-powered 8mm Lebel cartridge.
Oh, yeah.
These guys are still pretty dense, although, good lord, so much. I would rather carry this around.
I will say, going an entire day, we shot all of the Dutch rifles. I would still take that entire day of shooting over 1 day of shooting the Berthiers. It was we went through several loads with these guns too, and I would still take that over one round through all the Berthiers.
Now I know a lot of you say, "Oh, man up," but you know, fatigue is sort of a measurable resource, and so the less you get beat up by your gun, the more shots you can put down in an accurate way.
Exactly.
This to me feels much easier to use. Like I could feel like I get in and out of position with this a lot faster than the long rifle. The recoil is not so. It's not even heinous recoil. It's quite reasonable recoil for what it is. It's not an intermediate cartridge, however. No. A lot of people tend to think of these little 6.5 Dutch cartridges as being, you know, in that same vein as 6.5 Arisaka, and then you see people arguing that maybe 6.5 Arisaka was the original intermediate cartridge because what they want to do is they're wanting to talk about a certain Russian automatic rifle.
You've watched some people go down this rabbit hole, haven't you?
There's a lot of people that would like a certain Russian automatic rifle to be the first assault rifle, and that has kicked off a lot of conversations about these cartridges being intermediate. They're not. These are still full-powered rifle cartridges. They're just 6.5. And so, but again, you're throwing less mass. It doesn't commute as much of that down the stock. Mm-hmm. It's manageable despite being a light gun. So
that is something to say, honestly.
Is there anything that stands out as a shooter about this wood piece? Because that's really the last interesting feature.
You know, honestly, I would say there isn't, because it's really only going to be useful if I'm toting it around. And the problem is that we weren't really toting it around on the sling swivels. Right. Now, if I had it with the sling swivels against my back, that would have been beautiful, because I do not want to damage my clothing. Well,
as a generously proportioned male, sometimes my shirt...
Generously proportioned male.
Sometimes my shirt rides up and my Timmeltum sticks out from directions.
Yes.
And I will tell you, if I were to sling this gun, I would much prefer, with that risk in mind, to have the wood magazine piece, because it's less likely to be freezing cold on my love handle.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't think that was a military concern at the time. Actually, at the time, they were just trying to prevent you from wreaking havoc on your uniform, which, I mean, you can imagine wool uniforms or something with that hard metal edge just being rubbed against them all the time.
I'm sure they had nice little scrape marks wherever it was resting constantly.
Right. So, no real benefit to combat.
I don't think I noticed it. I think I vaguely remember feeling an extra piece of wood up against my, like, waist region, like
when you dropped it down to your hip.
Yeah. I think I vaguely remember that sensation, but honestly, it's such a small thing to think about that I can't even 100% say that's what I felt.
Now, all that said, how are we feeling about these guys in terms of World War I? The Dutch didn't fight in that conflict, although they did fight in World War II with these guys.
That's impressive.
Yeah, we're not asking questions about World War II though. That's a whole other basket. But how would you feel about something like this in World War I? Like, do you feel like that this would work, you know, in a trench? Do you feel like it would work in a field? Like, are you comfortable with this?
On a train, on a bus?
Would you take this on a bike? Would you take this for a hike? Would you ride with it on a horse? Would you love it? Of course.
I knew there was going to be a Seussical rhyme somewhere in here. I knew it. Honestly, yeah, these are getting pretty high up there in terms of hitting all of the right tick marks in my checklist of will this do it for me?
Right.
It's kind of getting up there with the Serbians, I want to say.
Yeah, the Romanian carbine is very much like these guys.
Yeah.
We did not 100 we liked it. You gave it. You kind of got rolled into a soft yes, but better than the long rifle.
Oh yeah.
The problem being in that gun was a little bit more the handling. The Dutch guns, especially the carbines, when we're talking about them as a class, it becomes very hard to say that, well, I don't like this or I don't like that, because the truth is you can have it any way you want it.
That was the thing, is that they thought about customizing.
Yeah, this is a two-order carbine. There's so many configurations so that they can be maximized to whatever unit.
I love that. It was cost effective. It's like, hey, we need these guys for doing this specific thing. Okay, well, let's change this up just a little bit and give them this one. That's perfect.
And the core functionality is there. I'd say, honestly, the biggest problem with these guns, other than the removable bolt head thing that we talked about last episode.
It's kind of funny and terrifying.
Is just being a Cavalry 88 derived gun. We have the split breech receiver, and we said this before, our bolt handle drops us off.
Just a little too far forward of the trigger.
Right.
Yeah, you have to sweep back. And unfortunately, no semi-pistol grip to pull back too quickly.
Yeah. The bigger sin is that this was not a sort of rear bolt handle with a turned down handle.
So basically what I'm saying is that I don't prefer this over the Serbian, but I do prefer it over the Romanian carbine, if I were to put it somewhere in that range.
That's a good point, because the Serbian, for those who don't remember, was a Mauser 93 family rifle. And so these are still what you would consider to be export Mannlichers, Schlegelmilks. And so they have some of those deficiencies, but they also are still sitting here 100 years later and still shooting, so we can't say that they were terrible rifles.
Yeah, they shot well.
I actually like Dutch carbines as a collector mentality. I find them to be one of the most enjoyable because there's so many variations.
I love that you could honestly just make an entire collection of these carbines. That's fantastic.
I can remember when I first started looking into these guns, because I saw one in a pawn shop here. When I found out how many versions there were, and at that time it was not easy to even look up that much. Like, I only knew of 5, and now I know there's 23 or something. So when I looked up how many versions there were, I got so excited. And then over the years, it's like the most wonderful thing as a collector is finding out how many Dutch carbines there are. And the worst thing about being a collector is finding out you will never own half of them because they're just gone.
Yeah, they were just turned into others or whatever. And it's like, oh great, that was cannibalized for this one and then turned into this one. Cool.
Yeah, now on the European ones that we covered today, there's extant versions of all of them still. Next episode, you're going to find out that some carbines like these were made and then went completely extinct. There's none. There's none anywhere.
Hooray.
Yeah, that's always depressing. But that's a matter for next episode. So is there anything else that you want to say about these little guys?
Honestly, I had a bunch of fun with these. I'm glad that some of these carbines are actually staying with us. Actually, these are all ours, aren't they?
Yeah, it's true. I've had that. That was one of the first guns I ever owned. It just turned up and I didn't really know what I was looking at, but it was inexpensive. And then in the past year, I turned up this one inexpensively too, although now that we've made this episode, sorry folks.
Oh, and also thank you, Matthew, I believe, helped us out with some stuff on this episode too.
Yeah, I'm going to give him a more proper thanks too after the credits in our update, so make sure you keep an eye out on that.
But other than that, had a ton of fun. I can't wait to take these out again, because we still have more ammo.
Bye, guys.
Later.
Alright gang, this episode got done with a lot of help from our friends. Most of the literature referenced was written by Boss Martens, who went above and beyond to share his knowledge with us and helped review this episode. Additionally, I've begged a fair bit of help off Matthew Willemsen, curator of the Dutch National Military Museum. For those of you who might be curious about the various Dutch rolling block carbines, I have left a link in the description to one of his articles. And finally, if you've enjoyed seeing all the various historical images of the Netherlands in our past 2 episodes, well, a fair few came from one well-curated collection which you can view at Zeeland1914-1918.nl. And if that's a mouthful, that's okay, because there is again a link in the show description. I recommend browsing for yourself and seeing how many models you can recognize. All right, gang, thanks for all the support, and I hope you have a good one.